I couldn't breathe. My chest was heaving, my skin damp with sweat as I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. His face loomed closer in the dim light, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood turn cold. My mind was screaming, every instinct telling me to run, but I was frozen, trapped by his gaze and the weight of his hand clamped around my wrist. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was my family, someone I was supposed to trust. But the look in his eyes, the quiet way he'd been watching me ever since we arrived, it all suddenly made sense. My mind raced back to the beginning, back to that phone call that changed everything, tearing us from the life we knew. But I couldn't dwell on that now. Right now, survival was all that mattered. The story didn't start here, but looking back, maybe I should have seen it coming. I froze, his hand tightened around my wrist, his fingers rough and unyielding. My heart pounded, screaming at me to move, to escape, but I was trapped in his gaze, his face barely recognizable as the man who used to bounce me on his knee as a kid. Now, there was something dark, something twisted lurking behind his eyes. My mouth went dry as I forced myself to stay calm, to look for any way out of this suffocating moment. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Just a few days ago, everything had been normal, or at least, it felt normal. My family had it all, a spacious house, steady income, and security. My dad was the man who could handle anything, the fearless real estate agent who had always provided for us. And my mom was the warm, nurturing teacher who kept our home full of light. And I was just an 18-year-old, happy to go along with the life we had. But then that call came in, shattering our world. It was a cold, gloomy afternoon. Dark clouds had rolled in thickly, blanketing the sky as if it was some kind of omen. My mom and I were in the kitchen, making dinner like always, the smell of her homemade soup filling the air, warming the space, despite the chill from outside. I remember her smile, the way she hummed softly as she cooked, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Then the phone rang, shattering the cozy silence. I'll never forget the look on my mom's face as she answered. It was my dad. And from the first word, her face paled. I stopped chopping vegetables, every nerve on edge, as I watched her grip the phone tighter, her expression twisting from confusion to fear. When she finally hung up, her hand was trembling. She looked at me, her voice barely a whisper as she relayed what he had said. The company had gone bankrupt. Every dollar we had was gone, and that wasn't even the worst part. We'd have to sell the house immediately, leave everything behind, or risk losing it all to debt collectors. But even with this bombshell news, he had a plan. Tomorrow, he'd said, we were to pack up and leave the city, head out to the countryside to live with my grandfather. It was the only place left that was ours, even though I could barely remember him, let alone the house. Mom assured me he'd take care of us, that he was family and family was all we had left now. The next morning, we piled what little we could fit into the car and set off, leaving behind everything I'd ever known. I didn't see my dad after that call. It was just my mom and me, driving down those endless winding roads, watching the familiar skyscrapers fade into fields and pastures. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and questions, but neither of us had the heart to say anything. Finally, we pulled up to the house. It stood at the end of a muddy, overgrown driveway, surrounded by thick, unkempt trees that blocked out the last rays of sunlight. The roof was sagging, the paint peeling, and everything about the place screamed decay. My heart sank. This was home now. The front door creaked open, and there he was, my grandfather, a thin, frail-looking man, his once bright eyes now shadowed and distant. He smiled at us, his gaze lingering a little too long on me as I stepped out of the car. I told myself it was nothing, just the shock of seeing his only grandchild after all these years. But something about his smile didn't sit right with me. Inside, the house was as bleak as the outside, filled with dusty furniture and dim lighting that gave everything a washed-out look. But he'd prepared a room for us, taken care to make sure we had everything we needed. I told myself he was just being thoughtful, but deep down, there was this nagging unease that I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, I tried to adjust to this new life. My grandfather was kind enough, always doting on us, telling stories, doing his best to keep things light. And yet, there was something off. I caught him watching me, just small glances at first, but then it became more frequent, like he couldn't help himself. His gaze wasn't warm like I remembered, it was intense, like he was seeing me for the first time, and not as his grandchild. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination, maybe the stress of everything that had happened. But as the days went by, it got harder to ignore. Every time I was alone, I felt his eyes on me. If I looked over my shoulder while brushing my hair in the hallway mirror, or even just sitting outside with a book, there he was, always watching. One day, my mom had to leave for town to take care of some paperwork with my dad, leaving me alone with him. I tried to act normal, but my skin prickled whenever he came too close. That evening, as the sun set and cast eerie shadows across the house, he brought me a plate of sliced fruit, neatly arranged, just like he used to do when I was little. He sat across from me, watching as I took a bite, his eyes never leaving my face. "You've grown up so much," he said quietly, his voice low and strange, like he was talking to himself more than me. "I remember when you were just a little girl. Now, you're a beautiful young woman." I forced a smile, hoping that would be enough to break the tension, but he kept going, his gaze piercing, almost admiring. I could feel my heart racing, my skin growing cold as he spoke, his compliments taking on a tone that made me uncomfortable. He wasn't looking at me like his granddaughter, he was looking at me like something else entirely. It was a few days later when my mom had to leave again, this time for the whole weekend. She promised she'd be back soon, but as she hugged me goodbye, I felt this deep sense of dread settle over me. I didn't know why, but something about being alone with him for that long made me uneasy. That night, I decided to keep my distance, staying mostly in my room. But as the hours passed, I could hear him pacing outside my door, the creak of the floorboards growing louder, closer. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming at me to lock the door. But I didn't want to make things worse. Instead, I just lay there, my breath shallow, listening to him pace back and forth until finally everything went quiet. The next morning I was outside, trying to distract myself by reading under one of the old fruit trees. The sun was warm, the air filled with the smell of overripe apples, and for a moment, I managed to forget everything that had been happening. But then I heard footsteps. I glanced up and there he was, approaching slowly, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves scattered on the ground. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were locked on me, unwavering. Every instinct told me to get up, to put distance between us. But I forced myself to stay calm, my heart racing as he came closer. He stopped a few feet away, holding out a glass of lemonade. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, his voice smooth, almost too friendly. I managed a polite smile, taking the glass from him with a shaky hand, careful not to let our fingers touch. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, trying to sound normal. But even as I took a sip, I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke. "You know," he said softly, "you look just like your mother when she was your age. Beautiful, with that same spark in your eyes." I felt a chill creep down my spine, his words hitting me in a way that felt far from grandfatherly. I forced a laugh, hoping it would lighten the mood. "Well, she's told me that before, too. Guess I'm lucky to take after her." But he didn't smile. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his gaze lingering. "Lucky, yes, very lucky." There was a strange, almost wistful tone to his voice, and I felt my stomach twist. I couldn't explain it, but something about him felt wrong, different. I set the glass down, pretending to be engrossed in my book again, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, his presence looming over me like a shadow. After a few agonizing moments, he finally turned and walked away, leaving me with a pounding heart and a growing sense of dread. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I stayed outside, trying to keep my distance, but every time I caught a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye, he was watching me, always watching. That night, I locked my door, telling myself it was just to feel safer, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards. I tried calling my mom, hoping she'd pick up and tell me she'd be home soon, but there was no answer. I left her a message, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled, betraying the fear I was feeling. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the house, I heard footsteps outside my room again. They paused right outside my door. I held my breath, my heart pounding as I stared at the door handle, praying he wouldn't try to come in. A long silence followed, and just when I thought he'd walked away, I heard his voice, low and soft. "You're such a good girl, aren't you, Lily? Always so polite, so quiet." I froze, every muscle tense, as I listened to him murmur through the door. His voice was calm, almost affectionate, but there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing he would go away, wishing my mom was here to make everything feel safe again. After what felt like an eternity, his footsteps receded, and I finally let out a shaky breath. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to get out. Early the next morning, I decided to go for a walk, needing to clear my head, to feel some sense of normalcy. The fields around the house stretched out for miles, and the crisp morning air helped me breathe a little easier. But as I wandered further, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. No one, just empty fields and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But that sense of dread lingered, creeping up my spine like a shadow I couldn't escape. Finally, I turned back toward the house, my steps quickening as I approached the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, it swung open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, blocking my path. "Where did you go?" he asked, his voice soft but edged with something darker. His gaze was intense, his eyes scanning me from head to toe, lingering just a little too long. Just for a walk," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Needed some fresh air." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You should be careful out there. Lots of dangerous things, especially for a young girl like you." My throat tightened, and I forced a smile, hoping it would ease the tension. "I'll be careful, Grandpa." He stepped aside, allowing me to enter, but as I brushed past him, I felt his hand rest on my shoulder. just for a moment, his grip firm. "That's my girl," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I barely managed to keep my composure as I slipped past him, my heart racing as I hurried to my room, closing the door behind me and locking it. I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't the grandfather I remembered. This was someone else, someone I didn't know and didn't trust. Days went by in a blur, each one filled with that same sense of unease, of something lurking just beneath the surface. He was always there, always watching, his eyes following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. One evening, as I was washing up in the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of him in the mirror, standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me. I froze, my breath hitching as I turned to face him, forcing myself to stay calm. "What is it, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just stared, his gaze unblinking, a strange smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You remind me so much of your mother," he said softly. "So beautiful. So perfect." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as I forced a weak smile. "Thanks, Grandpa. That's very kind of you to say." But he didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes roaming over me in a way that felt wrong, invasive. I took a step back, hoping he'd take the hint, but he didn't budge. "You know," he continued, his voice low and steady, "I've always wanted to protect you, to keep you safe. You're so precious to me, Lily. So special." My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a surge of panic rise up, but I forced it down, keeping my voice steady. "I appreciate that, Grandpa. Really, I do." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaken and terrified. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. This wasn't just discomfort, it was fear, raw and real, coursing through me every time I caught him looking at me. That night, I packed a small bag, barely able to breathe as I stuffed my things into it. I didn't have a plan, didn't know where I'd go, but I knew I had to get out. I couldn't wait for my mom to come back, I had to leave. Now, I crept down the stairs, my footsteps as silent as I could make them, but the old house seemed to amplify every creak, every rustle. Just as I reached the bottom step, I heard a sound behind me, a faint shuffle, the sound of breathing. I turned, and there he was, standing at the top of the stairs, his face shadowed in the dim light. His eyes bore into me, and my heart dropped, fear flooding my veins. "Going somewhere, Lily?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, but there was an edge to it, something dark and dangerous. I forced myself to stay calm, my mind racing for an excuse. I just needed some fresh air," I lied, hoping he wouldn't see through it. But he didn't move, didn't take his eyes off me. "At this hour?" he asked, his voice soft but cold. "Seems a little strange, don't you think?" He took a step down, his shadow stretching long and dark across the stairs. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure he could hear it, but I forced myself to stand my ground, fighting the urge to bolt. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely steady. "Sometimes it helps me sleep." He tilted his head, considering my answer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You seem frightened, Lily," he murmured, a sinister smile creeping onto his face. "There's no need to be scared. I would never let anything happen to you, your family. Special." The way he said special made my skin crawl, and I felt my pulse spike as he took another step closer. I knew I couldn't stay, couldn't let him get any closer. I need to go," I stammered, turning toward the door. "You don't need to go anywhere, Lily," he whispered, his face so close I could smell the stale scent of his breath. "Why don't you stay here with me?" Panic surged through me, a raw, desperate instinct that took over. I yanked my arm free with every ounce of strength I had, stumbling backward, my eyes wide as he stared back at me, his smile twisting into something almost hungry. "I'm leaving," I shouted, my voice breaking, but I didn't care. I had to get out no matter what. I turned, racing toward the back door, my feet pounding against the creaky floorboards, but I heard him close behind, his footsteps fast and relentless. I didn't dare look back, not until I threw myself through the back door and out into the cold night air. I ran across the darkened yard, my heart racing, my breath coming in gasps as I heard him call out behind me, "Lily, come back here." His voice was sharp, filled with a twisted urgency that only pushed me to run faster. I sprinted across the uneven ground, branches clawing at my skin, as I plunged into the thick trees at the edge of the property. I didn't stop, didn't dare to look back, every step fueled by sheer terror. My mind was spinning, barely able to process what was happening. But one thing was clear, I couldn't go back. I had to get away, to escape this nightmare that had somehow become my life. Somewhere in the distance, I heard him shout my name again, his voice echoing through the dark. But I kept running, deeper and deeper into the trees, until his voice was nothing but a fading whisper, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I didn't stop until dawn, until I was far from that house, far from him. And as the first light crept over the horizon, I finally allowed myself to breathe, to let the relief wash over me. I was free, but I would never forget.